This is Sheryl Hustler's Defense. I wanted to start by acknowledging her committee and introducing them for those of you who might not know. So in the back there is Sheryl's co-advisor, Chris Whalen. He's has an adjunct position here in our department, and he's also at Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida. And then we also have Paul Caradonna, who is at the Chicago Botanic Garden and Northwestern University. And then in our own department, we have Mary Ashley and Abby Nunez-Mira in the back. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Sheryl and her journey here, and then I'll let her take it away. Sheryl started at UIC in 2019, and before she even got here, she was being raved about by one of our faculty members who is now gone. I don't know how many of you knew David Wise, but David Wise was on Sheryl's committee when she was a master's student at Northern Illinois. And so David was very excited that Sheryl was applying, and he told us all about it and highly endorsed her admission into our department. And then she was further endorsed by the Graduate College, who gave her a 2-year university fellowship when she started here. Before coming here, as I mentioned, she was at Northern Illinois University. She did a master's there in biological sciences, where she studied dung beetles in prairie restorations at Nachusa grasslands. And then before that, she was at Pennsylvania State University, where she got a bachelor's with a dual major in English and recreation, park, and tourism management. Since Sheryl's been here, she's been quite the academic force. She, most years, has gone to multiple conferences each year. She's won 2 awards for her conference presentations. Just since she's been at UIC, she's been a co-author on 8 papers, or a lead author. And none of those are actually her dissertation papers. She has submitted 2 of her dissertation chapters already, and I suspect the 3rd will be submitted soon. She's also mentored at least 7 undergraduate research assistants at UIC. And in her spare time, she is very involved in science communication. She has helped to organize meetings about science communication and workshops on that topic. And then she also has her own YouTube channel as the roving naturalist, where she explains ecological concepts to non-ecologists in an accessible and engaging way. So today Sheryl's going to tell you about her dissertation that took place in residential neighborhoods. Apparently some of her homeowners are on Zoom right now, but also in power line corridors around the Chicago suburbs. And the work in the power line corridors was funded by a grant to Chris Whalen and me from ComEd, the power company that gives all of us our power here. And ComEd wanted more information about the ecological systems that were in the lands that they own and manage. So we were really lucky to be able to get Sheryl involved in this project, because she came here with already a lot of field experience and a lot of knowledge about plants and insects in the area. So she really helped us get the project up and running. So I just want to thank Sheryl for helping to make that project a success, and for being a great student and member of our lab for the last 5 years.
Thanks for the wonderful turnout, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Emily. Yeah, I'm really excited to share everything I've been doing during my dissertation with you today. So the title of the entire body of work is "The Floral Resource and Pollination Service Responses to Management Scale and Type in Suburban Areas." And I want to start with all of my thank yous. There are a lot of people to thank. First, I am extremely humbled by the generosity of the more than 100 homeowners and families who graciously allowed me access to their backyards during the years of my research. I literally could not have done this without all of you, so thank you so much. I also could not have done any of this without Benji. Thank you for putting up with me in the field every day, and for suffering through the extreme heat, the humidity, and the chiggers to count bees for me. You are a hero. Thank you to the UIC greenhouse staff, Matthew, Elise. You are wonderful. Thank you for helping me find a home for my cucumbers, and for tending to my baby Biden's Aristosa plants so that we could make this project happen. And of course, thank you so much to my lab family and my mentors and all of my friends here at UIC and beyond. Your support and mentorship have made me the scientist that I am today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a map to my talk because it's going to be long and sometimes I talk fast and I don't want you to get lost. So I'll start with expanding on the genesis of the project that Emily teased a little bit there at the beginning. Then I will briefly explain my interest in functional trait-based analyses and ecosystem functions and ecosystem services. Then I'll describe our study design and the methods that we used. Then I'll break it down into the sort of sub-studies or the 3 chapters of my dissertation. First, how management scale drives biodiversity patterns in Chicago. Then how niche complementarity affected cucumber pollination. And then how I attempted to capture the full complexity of pollination in our urban system. And then I'll wrap it all up with a summary because I talk fast. So again, this project all started because ComEd approached Chris and Emily with sort of 2 main interests that they wanted our help with. They were interested in help evaluating the ecological value of their power line corridors, or the strips of land that run under the high voltage lines. And they were also interested broadly in insect pollinators, especially things like monarch butterflies that are super charismatic. And when we think about the phrase ecological value, as ecologists, I think a lot of us probably immediately go to biodiversity. So in this context, we might think about the biodiversity of pollinators, things like the abundance of pollinating insects, or things like species richness or Shannon diversity. But when I think about ecological value, I tend to think about ecosystem functions and ecosystem services. So in this context, I was thinking about the ecosystem function of pollination. Why am I so interested in ecosystem functions, you might wonder? Great question. It's because we all rely on ecosystem functions for everything that's happening around us in our world. We rely on pollination, obviously, for food and the environment that grows around us. We need things like soil turnover and decomposition, prey population control, and even things like cultural ecosystem services to make our lives more rich and fulfilling. So I'm really interested in how all of these functions are being facilitated within the ecosystems where we live. And we can study ecosystem function using functional trait-based methods. Functional traits are characteristics of organisms that respond to variations in that organism's environment and or affect those ecosystem functions. And these traits can be physical or morphological, they can be physiological or internal chemistry, or they can be behavioral in the case of organisms that move around. So obviously plants don't tend to have behavioral traits. Plant height, however, is a great example of a functional trait that is both a response trait, or a trait that responds to environmental variation, and an effect trait, or a trait that affects an ecosystem function. And it is also a trait that has variation both inter-specifically, between species, and intra-specifically, within species. What do I mean? Here's an explanatory cartoon, the first of several. Here are 2 plant communities that are starting with the same assemblage of species. We've got some tall trees, some short shrubs, some short forbs, but this community is under the power line. So we're going to remove the tall woody vegetation because that cannot be under the power line corridor. And now we have 2 communities with different species composition. So this one now has shorter plant height because it does not have tall species in it anymore. So now these 2 communities vary in plant height because of a difference in the species that are present. We can also have that intra-species variation in plant height based on resource availability in the environment. So this time we have the same species composition in the 2 communities, but the community on your right has greater access to both water and nitrogen in the soil. So those plants might grow taller. And so now we have taller plant height on the right, even though the species are the same. And we know that taller plants would have higher net primary productivity, which is an incredibly important ecosystem function. So plant height, a functional trait that both responds to and affects ecosystem function and variation. So back to ComEd, and their main interests and their power line corridors. In the Chicago area, ComEd manages their power line corridors in 3 basic flavors. On your left, you have what we are calling the mown power line corridors. It's basically mown turf grass, as you might expect from the name. They're managed with really big, like industrial lawnmowers. Gets mown a few times every season. On the right, we have what we're calling our old field corridors. Those are managed on a 5-year rotation, where in the first 2 years of the management cycle, all of that tall, woody vegetation that I showed in the explanatory cartoon gets removed, manually cut. And then for the rest of the rotation, the plant community is allowed to just voluntarily assemble as it will. So the understory plants here are a combination of native and non-native volunteer plants of whoever feels like showing up. And then there are a few corridors in the Chicago area where they are either remnant or restored tallgrass prairie plant communities. The remnants are primarily power line corridors that run through some of the forest preserves in the Chicago region. And then the restored communities are a few corridors where ComEd has actually been working with a contractor to restore them with tallgrass prairie seed mixes. So if ComEd would like our help understanding whether their power line corridors in each of those 3 types contribute ecological value to the landscape, that means we need to compare them against something. And I decided I wanted to compare them against something that covers a lot of the rest of the Chicagoland landscape, and that would be residential yards. We know from the urban ecology literature that a lot of research has been done in residential yards because they cover so much space, but a lot of that research has been done in front yards for a variety of reasons. And we posit that front yards and backyards may be managed very differently because of differences in whether or not they are visible to the public. So I was really interested in expanding the research on residential backyards. So that's where I chose to do my research. So here we have a map of our study sites in Chicago. Our sites were split into 4 research clusters. Got way up here in Crystal Lake, Morton Grove, Glendale Heights, Elmhurst area, and then down in Woodridge, Naperville. In each of those 4 research clusters, we have 3 power line corridors, 1 in each of those 3 flavors, and then 3 residential neighborhoods, 1 loosely paired with each of the power line corridors. So 6 sites in each cluster. And then within each site, we had 6 sampling modules that were 5 meter by 5 meter square. In the power line corridors, they were set up relatively linearly with at least 15 meters separating them. Relatively linearly because sometimes we had to avoid things like the towers in the power line corridors or other sort of anomalies in the landscape. And then in the residential neighborhoods, we set up the 5 meter by 5 meter squares in the backyards of the houses that had provided permission for us to do our research. Within each of those modules, Benji and I did a bunch of sampling. I did floral resource surveys within the modules where I counted all of the flowers that were blooming at the time of the survey and identified all of the plants to species or genus in the case of a lot of the plants that were ornamentals like cultivars in a lot of the residential yards. And then we also did surveys of the bees. Benji did timed observations in the sampling modules, so he stood for 10 minutes and counted and identified 2 species or genus if they were moving too fast, all of the bees that interacted within the sampling module or flew through. And I also set out arrays of pan traps to capture smaller bees that we wouldn't have been able to identify by sight. Pan traps are shallow plastic bowls filled with a dilute soap solution that allow us to capture bees that we can then bring back to the lab and process and identify under the microscope. And then, as I teased earlier, when thanking the greenhouse crew, I did 2 different sentinel plant assays that I'll describe in more detail when we get to those chapters later. So now it's time for the actual results of what I did. We'll start with my first chapter, Management Scale Drives Bee and 4 Biodiversity Patterns in Suburban Green Spaces. We had 2 research questions for this chapter. First, how does management scale affect alpha, beta, and gamma biodiversity for different trophic levels? And secondly, does management type produce distinct communities of organisms, and how are these communities related? So we'll start with that first research question because there's kind of a lot of stuff in there. First, what we mean by management scale is the difference between power line corridors and residential neighborhoods. Power line corridors are representative of large-scale management because ComEd, a single manager, is responsible for the management of all of the power line corridors in the Chicago region, and also because any one linear area of power line corridor where our modules were set up was being managed the exact same way. So all 6 modules in a row in any one corridor were either mown or Oldfield or prairie. So they were considered large-scale management. Conversely, in a residential neighborhood, we were considering that small-scale management because all 6 modules in a neighborhood were each being managed by an individual family or homeowner. And so the decisions there were entirely individual and separate from one another. So they represent small-scale management. Of course, alpha diversity is the, in our case, species richness in any single sampling module. Beta diversity is the difference in species richnesses between sampling modules, and then gamma diversity would be the species richness at the site level. So for all of these graphs I'm going to show you, site management type will be on the x-axis. So we've got mown, Oldfield, prairie. Those are all the power line corridors, large-scale management. And then residential neighborhoods on the right-hand most side. And on the y-axis for this graph, we have our floral resource alpha diversity. And you can see here, really interesting, the prairie-type corridors have much higher alpha diversity for our floral resources than any of the other management types. I think this is really interesting and actually kind of encouraging because tallgrass prairie is one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world, and in the state of Illinois, less than 0.1% of this historic land cover persists today. So the fact that the prairie-type power line corridors in the Chicago region might be a bastion of these rare plants at this point is really exciting. I also want to draw your attention to a pattern that we will see over and over again in my results, which is that there's a huge amount of variation in the residential neighborhoods. This is really important because previous research from the minor lab and lots of other urban ecology labs has shown that a lot of different landscape and demographic characteristics of neighborhoods determine the vegetative makeup of neighborhoods. So I'm glad that we were able to capture so much variation in neighborhoods in the Chicagoland area that we didn't sample a whole bunch of neighborhoods that were very similar. And we were able to really see a lot of different kinds of neighborhoods within our study. Now I will show you the alpha diversity for bees in a graph on the right so we can compare the patterns. And we see something kind of similar. Again, prairie-type corridors have high alpha diversity. Oldfield corridors this time are also kind of high and mown as well. So we see basically the patterns for bees are a little muddier than they were for the plants, and this pattern is going to persist as we continue through this chapter. But it is interesting to see the alpha diversity for the bees is still kind of high in the corridors as well. This time we have floral resource gamma diversity, so that's the species richness at the whole site level on the left-hand graph. And this time we see that both the prairie-type corridors and the residential neighborhoods had really high floral resource gamma diversity. So again, really cool. Prairie corridors might have a lot of species diversity in them, which is neat. And the residential neighborhoods have a lot of species diversity in them, which isn't necessarily a surprise. One of our hypotheses was that there would be a lot of species in residential neighborhoods because of that small-scale management. Each yard can have its own community of species that aren't necessarily related to the species in any other yard because of individual choices being made. On the right, we have the bee community. Again, patterns a little fuzzier, just like the bees. But again, the prairie and Oldfield corridors have a trend towards slightly higher bee gamma diversity. And now we'll take a look at beta diversity, which is where we're getting into really exciting results for this chapter. Wow, the residential neighborhoods have way higher beta diversity than any of the corridors. So we can very clearly say now that small scale management had way higher floral resource beta diversity than large scale management. And the bees do not have a statistically significant pattern for beta diversity, but we can see it's kind of trending in that direction. So the next two graphs, I'm just going to zoom in on these floral resource beta diversity results, and we're going to break beta diversity down into two components that sort of help us understand where that beta diversity or where that difference between sampling modules comes from. And those two components of beta diversity are turnover and nestedness. Turnover is a measure of species replacement between sampling modules. So basically, this sampling module has these two species, and this sampling module has two species that are completely different. Nestedness is species loss between sampling modules. So basically, this sampling module has these two species, and the sampling module next door has one of those two species. So they are related or nested within one another. And we can see that the small scale management or residential neighborhood beta diversity is primarily and very significantly being explained by turnover, which again supports that hypothesis we had about the individual choices being made by homeowners driving the differences between the sampling modules in our residential neighborhoods or between the yards in the residential neighborhoods. So there are different plant species in each yard because there's no reason for any two homeowners to have put the same plant species in their yards next to one another. Conversely, and this makes sense given where we're sort of going with this thought pattern, the large-scale management or the power line corridors seem to have higher nestedness, which, given the way they're managed, makes sense again, right? If all of these sampling modules are being managed the same way, it would make sense that they have a nested or similar set of species in all of the sampling modules in one stretch of power line corridor. I'll also show you the turnover and nestedness for the bee communities, but again, not statistically significant, and the results are quite a bit muddier, and we're not necessarily seeing a pattern here. But it's not super surprising because bees can get up and move around. They don't have to sit with their feet in one spot the way plants do. So it would make sense that perhaps bees are not responding to management at quite as small a scale as an individual backyard as we were measuring. And so maybe the scale that we were measuring biodiversity at for these patterns was just too small to find any patterns for the bees. So now we'll move on to the second research question for this chapter, which was, does management type produce distinct communities of organisms, and how are these communities related? So the graph I'm going to show you now looks like a hot mess, but please do not be frightened. It's a lot easier to understand than it looks. Yeah. So this is called a nestedness with overlap and decreasing fill. And basically what that means is that all of the rows and columns in this graph are arranged such that the cells are more filled towards the top and the left. So you get this kind of filled triangle to the top left and an empty triangle to the bottom right. That's how you get the decreasing fill. See? And basically what this is telling us is that the floral resource communities for all of the residential neighborhoods are nested within one another, or that they are related. So even though any two sampling modules or any two yards in a neighborhood might be very different from one another, all of the neighborhoods across the Chicago region do have quite a few similarities in their floral resource communities. And that seems to be being driven by a few really, really popular cultivars like roses and hostas, and also by a few really, really common yard weeds like white clover and dandelions. Here is an NODF, nestedness with overlap and decreasing fill, of the power line corridor floral resources. And again, it shows us a similar pattern. We've got a filled triangle to the upper left and an empty triangle to the lower right, which shows us that the power line corridor plant communities are also nested within one another. But this time I broke it down, color-coded by the corridor management type. And we see this really interesting pattern where the Moan power line corridors are actually nested under the Oldfield power line corridors, are actually nested under the Prairie power line corridors. And that's kind of a cool pattern because it demonstrates to us that there might be some sort of environmental filtering or assembly pattern going on here, that there are probably some sort of like weedy species present throughout the urban area, or some species that their seeds persist in the soil and are just showing up in all of our sites regardless of their management. And so the implications for this first chapter were that biodiversity does, in fact, respond to management scale, where our large-scale management type, or our power line corridors, had lower beta diversity and higher beta nestedness. And our small-scale management, or our residential neighborhoods, had higher beta diversity because of higher beta turnover. And that power line management techniques produced unique flowering plant communities that are nested within one another. And that mobile organisms like bees, although that is a syrphid fly, not a bee, may be less sensitive to small-scale management or disturbance. Okay, chapter 2, cucumber time. So my second chapter title is "The Abundance and Niche Complementarity Have Opposing Effects on Cucumber, Cucumis sativus, Pollination." So this is the first chapter where I used a sentinel plant experiment. So for this experiment, the greenhouse graciously put up with me while I grew 5-gallon buckets filled with cucumber plants, 300 buckets. And then we placed those buckets out in our field sites and left them for a week so that they could receive pollination services by the insect pollinators in the sites, then brought them back to the greenhouse lawn where they stayed until the pollinated flowers matured into cucumber fruits. Then I harvested those fruits and returned them to the lab, where I removed the seeds and counted all of the seeds. And so the two measures of pollination that I have for this study are the ratio of fruits resulting from starting female flowers, and also a count of the seeds coming from the fruits that I harvested. There's the 300 buckets. They were so heavy. So the research questions for this chapter were: are cucumber fruit and seed set best explained by taxonomic diversity, complementarity metrics, or functional identity metrics of the bee community? And what characteristics of the sites best explain variation in relevant components of the bee community? So we sort of broke the way we analyzed our data down into a few steps. So first we took these cucumber fruit and seed set and ran linear models trying to understand which components of the bee community would best explain those metrics of pollination. And our measures of the bee community were either taxonomic diversity, so things like species richness and Shannon diversity, complementary metrics, so these are trait-based indices, functional trait-based indices like functional richness, functional evenness, or functional identity metrics. So these are also functional trait-based metrics, but they're metrics based on a single functional trait rather than an accumulation of functional traits. And then, after we'd figured out which of these measures of the bee community best explained pollination, we ran more linear models where those components of the bee community were now the response variables, and we used characteristics of the sites, like characteristics of the floral community and also site management, to try to figure out which characteristics were best explaining or affecting the bee community. So here we have on the x-axis the log transformed total abundance of honeybees, and on the y-axis the ratio of successful fruits. So that was one of our measures of pollination. And right off the bat, that negative relationship is kind of weird. We're very used to assuming that honeybees, they're pollinators, they're crop pollinators, shouldn't more honeybees mean more cucumbers? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'm going to walk you through a story here with a few more graphs. So we're going to take, this is a strong explainer of pollination, and we're going to flip it and put it on the y-axis now. So now it's a response variable, right? So now we've got log total abundance of honeybees is negatively responding to floral resource Shannon diversity. So there are fewer honeybees when there are more different flowers in a community. What's going on? Well, okay, so now we'll take floral resource Shannon diversity and put it on the y-axis and put site management type on the x-axis, and we see that the sites that I think you've all been assuming in your head were better habitat versus worse habitat have differences in their floral resource Shannon diversity, right? So perhaps if we walk through these graphs in our minds and we look at the story here, perhaps there are more honeybees hanging out in sites that are lower quality habitat overall, that have fewer floral resources in general, or fewer different kinds of floral resources in general. So maybe there are more honeybees in sites where there are fewer other kinds of bees. And we know from the pollination literature that small native solitary bees are actually really important for pollination, including for crop pollination. So maybe honeybees are hanging out in low quality habitat and there aren't those really important native pollinators hanging out there, and they were actually way more important for the cucumbers than we realized. We also saw, now that we're looking at seeds per fruit instead of fruit set, log total abundance of honeybees had a negative relationship with seed set. Again, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but this might actually be being driven by honeybee abundance, because honeybees are social bees. So when you find one honeybee in a site, you're likely to see a lot of them. And again, the log total abundance of bees was negatively related to floral resource functional divergence, which again is a different kind of measure of the diversity or the functional diversity of the floral resource community, kind of like floral Shannon diversity was. So a similar kind of story here. But it's not all bad for the cucumbers, because we did find that there was a positive relationship between bee community functional evenness and the average seeds per cucumber fruit. And this is an indication of something that's known in the literature as niche complementarity. So this is the idea that a community that has a more even representation of multiple values for functional traits has higher ecosystem functioning. So to put that a little more simply, we have a big department with a lot of people who have lots of different kinds of skill sets. So we have a really high publication output, right? If we had a small department with only a few people who all had the same expertise, or we had a big department with a bunch of people, but there were, a few clusters of people who had an expertise, but there weren't there wasn't an even distribution of people with expertises, we wouldn't necessarily have the same productivity. So when we have an even distribution within the community, those bees all sort of fill different functional niches and create a more effective pollination service. Thank you to one of my homeowners for snapping the cutest picture I have ever achieved during fieldwork. This happened in one of the backyards during the cucumber assay. It didn't eat any of the plant, which is great. So the implications from this chapter are that honeybees might be less effective pollinators, or they may be dominating in lower quality habitats. More bees does not guarantee more pollination, but that bee functional evenness or niche complementarity might be promoting better pollination services. And then finally, we go to the chapter where I really wanted to stretch what I was doing here. Look at that fuzzy bee fly. So here I tried to do something a little new and different and attempted to capture the full complexity of an urban pollination system using this beautiful plant, Biden's aristosa, sometimes called swamp marigold. It is a native annual prairie plant. It likes to have its feet kind of wet. You might have guessed that from being called swamp marigold. And the research questions here were what direct and indirect relationships between site management, flowering plants, and bees drive pollination services in Chicago, and also can native plants added to urban green spaces receive adequate pollination services to reproduce self-sustainably? So the reason I say this was kind of a stretching point for me is because a lot of pollination studies have done sentinel plant experiments before, but almost all of them have used cultivars like cucumber, apples, coffee, jalapeno. But I really wanted to do something with native plants because, as Emily said before, I have a background in restoration, and my real love is trying to create spaces where both wild things and people can live together. So I'm really interested in trying to figure out how we can achieve functional, healthy, natural spaces in cities. So I want to know if that's possible. And this was my first attempt. I promised some of you a meme. So most of us use linear models to try to understand relationships between variables in our systems. And I just told you about a whole bunch of linear models that I did in my cucumber system, which is fine. We can use linear models. They're great for looking at sets of relationships. I can look at how components of the bee community affect pollination. I can look at how management affects a component of the plant community one at a time. I can look at how the plant community affects a component of the bee community one at a time. That's a lot of one at a time in it. But if I use a structural equation model, in this case I used a piecewise structural equation model, I can look at all of it at once, which to me makes a whole lot more sense because an ecosystem is all of it at once, and even a whole lot of it that I'm not including on this slide because this is a two-dimensional slide and an ecosystem is so many dimensions. So yeah, I taught myself how to do structural equation models in 3 months. So basically what this does is try to model all of these relationships and give us sort of the strength of all of these relationships. And so any one of these vectors, and this is the hypothesized set of relationships, any one of these vectors, the value associated with it would be the strength of the relationship directly between the two boxes. But if you wanted to know the relationship between this box and this box, you could follow the path of vectors between them to understand both direct and indirect relationships between factors in your path model. So these are all the variables that I included in my structural equation model for now. The italicized values are the marginal R-squared values. And even though, like in the hypothesized model I just showed you, there are vectors running between most of these boxes, I'm just going to show you the ones that are more statistically significant because otherwise this would be a huge mess to try and read. So the vectors that are solid lines are those that are significant at the p is less than 0.05 level, and the vectors that are dashed are significant at the p is less than 0.1 level, and the width of the vector is indicative of the strength of the relationship between the two boxes. And then I could put a little glow around them to indicate the sign of the relationship. So a green glow indicates a positive relationship and a gray glow indicates a negative relationship. Asterisk, management is a categorical variable, so positive versus negative relationship coming from that variable is a little, there's a little bit of a weird interpretation going on there. But I want to focus in on just a handful of these relationships quickly to talk about what maybe is going on here as I try to wrap my brain around how best to use structural equation models in systems like this. So we'll start with management affecting log floral functional richness. So again, we're back to my favorite, functional trait-based metrics. So functional richness is a measure of the breadth of values for functional traits. And again, not necessarily what we would have expected right off the bat, where mown power line corridors have higher functional richness for plants than old field corridor sites or residential neighborhoods. So I want to zoom in on that for a moment, because I had to do some reading and some hard thinking to try to figure out why that might be. And what I came up with is that a mown power line corridor is a site where there's a lot of disturbance, a lot of activity, a lot of management, these industrial lawnmowers coming through every few weeks. And that creates an environment that is very stressful. And grasses are really highly competitive, and we didn't include them in our species counts because they're not floral resources, but they are absolutely dominating in those sites, right? So any other plants, flowering plants that we did count, that might be able to survive in a site like this are going to have to be very, very different from grasses and from one another in order to be able to survive in these sites. So they're going to have very different values in their functional traits in order to be able to exploit niches that are different from those being exploited by the grass and the other rare species present in those sites. So I think that might be why the mown sites have higher functional richness, is because all these little rare things sticking up amongst the grass are trying to eke out an existence by being a little different. I also wanted to focus in briefly on residential sites having lower functional richness than everyone else. Again, huge variation, which again, neighborhoods are widely different based on lots of different factors, but having lower functional richness might be because there are certain traits of ornamental plants that are just considered more valuable or more attractive. And so perhaps there are sets of values for certain functional traits that are just more likely to be included in residential landscaping. I also want to focus on this sort of double negative relationship between two components of the floral resource community and bee functional richness. So again, functional richness, the breadth of the values of functional traits, and floral abundance, that's easy enough. It's just the sheer number of flowers in a site. And we would think more flowers good, but more flowers doesn't tell us who those flowers are. So more flowers isn't actually necessarily good if they're really yucky flowers. And that brings me to the floral functional dispersion. So again, a trait-based metric. And here's another explanatory cartoon, because functional dispersion is a multi-dimensional metric that is really kind of difficult to understand. So I'm going to squash it down to 2 dimensions on this slide and sort of try to walk you through it as best I can. So here is a very real community. This is one of our mown power line corridors, a bunch of plant species that you probably recognize. They might be growing in your lawn. So these are the 9 species growing in this mown power line corridor. But of course, they're not all equally represented or equally growing in this mown power line corridor, right? So here are the counts of flowers and also a circle to represent both the color of the flowers and, you know, their percentage represented in the community. Holy red clover, right? Lots of red clover in this mown power line corridor. So functional dispersion, as I said, is a multi-dimensional measure where a centroid, or a spot that's supposed to be, you know, indicating the quote-unquote center of this community, is weighted by the abundance of species. So it is pulled gravitationally, as it were, by more abundant species. So the centroid would go that way. But then functional dispersion is calculated by the distances of all of the species to the centroid. So even though these 2 species, 2 of 9 species is just 22% of the species, they are representing 90% of the flowers in this site. And because they are so over-representing the abundance of flowers in this site, they pulled the centroid way far away from everyone else, and that has created a really high functional dispersion. But those two plants might not be the best plants for a really functionally rich bee community. I think Benji could agree with me. We saw a ton of bumblebees on red clover. Bumblebees love red clover, which is great. We love bumblebees. But maybe the small native bees don't. And bumblebees and small native bees have entirely different functional trait values. So maybe a site like this Moan Powerline Corridor that is entirely dominated by red clover has a very functionally reduced bee community that's dominated by large-bodied, fuzzy bumblebees, and not by any other kinds of bees. So that might be why we're seeing high functional dispersion of plant communities means low functional richness of bee communities. So the implications of this chapter, which is my most recent analysis, so stay tuned for more. We didn't find any statistically significant direct effects on the pollination of my Biden's Aristosa plants, which means maybe I missed something, maybe I didn't measure something that was important, or maybe I didn't include the right things in my structural equation model. I also found negative patterns associated with functional richness and functional dispersion. So maybe there are filters in the urban landscape, whether because of these really dominant weedy species or because of these really aggressive disturbances that are changing the communities in certain ways. And also that pollination systems are really complicated, and it might be really difficult for us to adequately model those complexities in a way that finds statistically significant patterns. All right, so here's the summary in case I talk too fast for you. I studied biodiversity and ecosystem functioning in powerline corridors and residential yards in the Chicago landscape. My first chapter was about management scale and type and how they affected biodiversity. I found that the prairie powerline corridors had high alpha and gamma biodiversity, and that the residential neighborhoods had high beta diversity that was driven by beta turnover. In my cucumber pollination chapter, I found that seed set decreased with bee abundance and honeybee abundance, but that seed set increased with bee functional evenness. And in my Biden's Aristosa pollination chapter, I found that urban areas may filter communities and that pollination systems are really complex and difficult to model. And with all of that said and done, I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
The committee members could just hold their questions for the defense, but anyone else, please ask away.
Yeah, there's the connection between honeybees and cucumbers.
Yes.
Did you just look at honeybees, or were there on another bees?
Yeah, so I separated honeybees out from, so I did do analyses with the whole bee community and then also with honeybees separately. And we separated honeybees out because of several reasons. First, because honeybees are not wild. They may be present on the landscape because somebody has them in hives in their backyard, right? Or because they are feral on the landscape, right? Even when they are not in someone's hives, they're domesticated, right? That they're not wild. And also because honeybees have very specific characteristic pollination behaviors that are different from a lot of other bees. And so I kind of had it in my mind that maybe they would be kind of different than other pollinators. So yeah, I was sort of curious. It was kind of an exploratory thing that turned into an interesting story. Yeah.
Can we interpret as honeybees excluding maybe other better pollinators from?
Yeah, so that's something that a lot of people are interested in, of whether or not honeybees are like out competing other bees. I don't think that my results or that my analyses are really designed in such a way that we could say like, yes, there's competition going on here. But that is something that a lot of people are certainly interested in. Yeah. Thank you.
you say, forgive me if I have it slightly wrong, functional evenness was associated with more seeds for zucchini?
Yeah.
Why would functional evenness help a single species? So, I mean, your functional traits have to do with what they're likely to pollinate, right? So,
Not exactly what they're likely to pollinate. And it wouldn't necessarily just be for the cucumber. The cucumber was what I was using to measure pollination services, but functional evenness is just saying that there is a more even distribution based on the abundance of the species, a more even distribution of the values for the functional traits in the community. And so niche complementarity says that when there's a more even distribution of values for the traits in the community, there's higher functioning because more niches are being filled more completely, if that makes sense. So basically the idea is then that like pollination services would be more complete, more full. So like, I guess where we're going with this is that ideally any sentinel plant you would have used in that situation probably would have done better is the idea, right? But maybe not, because lots of different plants require different kinds of pollination, different qualities of pollination. So yeah, again, it's more is always better. I would like to try more different kinds of plants with different flower morphologies in order to see, what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, anecdotally, I mean,
Yeah.
well, did you remember, did you catch any Thelassa or Epinepus on your cucumbers?
Yeah, Emily asked that too. Did not see any of the squash bees the year that we did cucumber. Saw squash bees during the Biden's Aristosa year. No squash bees during the cucumber year, weirdly. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. And it was weird because like I looked for cucumber plants on the landscape ambient, like outside of the ones that we placed on the landscape during that study, because we were doing it in residential yards. So like a lot of my homeowners had vegetable gardens with cucumber, zucchini, pumpkin, whatever. No squash bees. I don't know.
I've been at like 7 years where I am just getting
Yeah. I don't know.
Any interest in nest site availability for your studies?
Yeah, I did think about that. It's again one of those like it was just the team of the two of us, and time and people limited. I had grand ambitions of doing like quadrats initially and looking at things like bare ground availability and stems and stuff, but just ran out of time. But yeah, again, that's something I'd love to think about, because we did, when we're looking at back on my SEM here. Found this direct effect of management on the bees. So we think, maybe that's got something to do with like management affecting like nest site availability or whatever, but we didn't directly look at nest site availability. So can't say for certain right now. Yeah.
Sheryl, why does the power company use different management practices?
That is a great question.
That's kind of my one question, and then the other one, how do they feel? Where are you at with them? Have you been able to persuade them one way or the other?
What's to advisor for
Versus
what I'm
to-
allowed to say politically? They didn't tell us.
They didn't tell you how they felt about what you thought?
They didn't. We asked them why, and they
No, we know why they mow.
well, because they said there were community complaints, but then they
Yeah.
weren't very specific about who or when.
So
And
apparently
then-
they don't like to mow, is what they told us.
Which
'cause
makes
it's expensive.
sense. Yeah.
It's expensive, yeah.
But they mow if there's some kind of request that they mow, because their corridors are going through towns and neighborhoods and
Yeah.
all that.
But then, like Megan's results, it seemed like nobody was happy with the mown corridors. So I don't know, it's very confusing.
Yeah, so we did some social surveys of the people living near the corridors, the 3 different kinds, and asked them how much they liked the corridors and what they thought about them. And people generally preferred the non-mown corridors. So our guess was that it was just kind of a vocal minority, maybe a few people who really wanted that neat, tidy look, that complained loud enough to comment.
Because even the native kind of corridor requires management.
Yeah.
You can't let the trees grow back up.
Right.
Because that's counterintuitive for the power.
Yeah. I don't know. And like the Of the prairie corridors that we use, so again, there were 4 research clusters, so there were 4 prairie powerline corridors. 2 of them were that remnant type where they were actually in a forest preserve, and then 2 were the planted type, and they were very young. So for anyone who isn't super familiar with like how prairie restoration works, when they first put the seed mix down, it takes quite a few years for the seeds that they planted to actually like make a showing in the community. And so when we were in those sites, like there were multiple times that Benji and I were there, and they were actively mowing down non-native invasive, just like huge swaths of something. So the community that was present in those prairie sites wasn't even 100% prairie just because they were so baby. So yeah, they certainly do require a lot of management. I think it would be really interesting to turn this into like a long-term study and watch them grow and change and, you know, figure out how sustainable it is to manage them as prairie long-term. Because of course you can't probably burn them in amongst residential neighborhoods and stuff, but yeah, I don't know. Anybody else?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about, it was super interesting how you found that the mode corridors had the higher functional diversity than the residential, and the other was Oldfield.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? And if I understand your explanation correctly, is that these exactly these is that flowering plants really have to work hard to compete with the grasses, and pretty much the mode corridors are their only opportunity essentially to.
Not that it's their only opportunity, but just that, so grasses are really, really, really aggressive competitors. And so in the mown corridors where like mowing is a really aggressive disturbance, because like it's really hard to survive when you're getting your head chopped off every few weeks, right? Like, because the plant terms, your apical meristem or the tippy top where you're like making new growth, if that keeps getting chopped off and you don't have a growth strategy where you can recover from that, you won't keep living, right? So all of the plants that live there either have to be really short so they don't get their heads chopped off, or they have to be able to recover from that or have a resprouting strategy. And they have to be using resources in the environment differently from the grasses, right? So like have to be using water differently, have to be using nutrients from the soil differently, have to be using sun differently from the way the grasses are using it in order to be able to persist against the highly competitive grasses. So that's what I'm trying to say. Not that this is the only place they could persist, but that if they are going to exist here, they have to be very different from the grasses and from one another so that they can be there. Yeah.
So you're saying that's more true of the mode than it's for the residential.
Because like in a residential yard, most of the plants that are there are being intentionally put there, right? Or they're in the lawn where, you know, kind of the same principle applies. And in the Oldfield corridors, there's very little management. So whatever's in the seed bank can kind of like pop up and do its thing, right? Yeah.
Thanks for explaining that.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I was just curious if maybe you said this now, just not paying attention.
Yeah.
If you were thinking or have thought about the different scales of each site, you know, because the corridors might have a different square footage, the residential backyard has a different square footage, and how would that affect your results?
Yeah, you mean like the width of the corridors of the So that's why we did the 5 meter sampling module to try to deal with that. Obviously, you're right that like the overall amount of habitat is going to change things. I think we did talk about the corridors that we picked are relatively the same width to try to control for that, and also all of the power line corridors are bounded on at least one, if not both sides, by residential neighborhood. So we were trying to like minimize variation, but yeah, like those clusters, the closer in toward the city, the smaller the yard, the farther west, the bigger the yard. So yeah, there is quite a bit of variation. It's a little difficult to extricate some of those things from one another. I think, yeah, it would be interesting to do some more GIS analyses and look at that stuff. But yeah, I mean, more sampling sites would always be better.
Yeah, that was another question
Yeah.
I had, like, did you start with a certain amount of sites for your residential backyards? And what happened?
Well,
Did you or-
I started with 9, and Paul told me to cut the number of sites, and then Megan and I made more sites. Somewhere between my prelims and the first field season, we added more sites. Yeah. 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 I mean, I don't know. I always, yeah, more field sites would be better, but after a certain point, you know,
Yeah.
I could only drive Benji so hard before he, you know, not come back.
And the convincing of the owners too.
Yeah, that was really fun. All of the homeowners have been incredible. Really, really wonderful. Yeah.
We should probably get on to the next stage of the defense,
Yeah.
but thank you everyone for coming, and thanks again, Sheryl.
Thank you so much, everyone.
The defense is gonna be in the room that's right on the other side of this wall. So you go left,